Hi, I'm Hugo Bown-Anderson, and welcome to High Signal. The goal of this podcast is to help you advance your careers in data science, machine learning, and AI by speaking with experts in the field. Today, I'm speaking with Gabriel Weintraub, the Amman Professor of Operations, Information, and Technology at Stanford Graduate School of Business. Gabriel is an expert in data science, operations, and market design, with deep experience studying how digital platforms like Uber, Mercado Libre, and Airbnb reduce friction and optimize matches. He was also part of the Chilean team that won the prestigious Edelman Prize in 2022 for improving COVID-19 response strategies through analytics. In our conversation today, we dive into the challenges and opportunities for companies to adopt data-driven strategies, focusing on how non-tech native organizations can build the foundations needed to leverage data science and AI. Gabriel discusses the gaps he's observed between C-level leadership and technical teams, the importance of starting with practical, high ROI projects, and fostering a culture of experimentation where even negative results drive learning and progress. Although the challenges in Latin America are shaped by its unique context, they reflect broader struggles faced by non-tech native organizations globally. Gabriel's insights offer valuable lessons for companies across industries in both developing and developed economies, from legacy businesses in the US to startups in Chile. We explore how generative AI is reshaping innovation by lowering technical barriers, enabling smaller teams and less technical users to create impactful solutions. Additionally, Gabriel shares his perspectives on the AI and data science landscape in Latin America, highlighting the region's immense talent pool and the need for greater investment in corporate R&D. He discusses the role of local innovation systems in fostering startups, the potential of domain-specific language models like a Chilean LLM, for example, and how AI can address critical challenges in areas like government, education, and healthcare. This episode is a mix of practical strategies for organizations and reflections on the global implications of AI and data science. Before we jump into the full episode, here are 3 clips that highlight some of Gabriel's most compelling insights. To start, Gabriel highlights the foundational steps organizations need to take before diving into AI or machine learning. This includes building basic data pipelines and focusing on simple, high ROI projects. Here's what he said.
There's this gap that I see between the C-level and the people on the ground trying to implement these tools, where like the C-level doesn't really understand what they need to do, what's the value of using data, and then just things get lost in translation. The other one is what is the starting point? I think sometimes you talk with executives and tell them, well, we need AI. And then you ask basic questions. It's like, where is your data? If I ask you a simple question about, say, your sales, can you access data to give me a quick answer? And in many cases, the answer is no. So it's just like very hard to think about building like machine learning models, like AI models, if you don't have the basic data structure in place, like the pipelines in place, and understanding that, and that this is going to be a journey, that there's, you need to start with the basics. I think that's really important, and I think many times in the discussion it gets overlooked. Start with the basics, and the basics are typically building the pipelines, the data pipelines. You cannot analyze data if you don't have structured data. And maybe the other third thing, which is, I think it's important to start with like low-hanging fruit. Right?
Next, Gabriel discusses how data teams must be integrated into the business rather than working in isolation. Solving impactful problems requires collaboration between data leaders and business leaders. Take a listen.
And I think data teams, like or data, if there's a data leadership, I think they also play a role, because when you have a technical team, there's a tendency to solve like interesting technical problems, and maybe those interesting technical problems aren't the most relevant for the business. So I think there's a responsibility also for the data team to engage with the business, to understand the business, to find partners, business partners, so that they actually solve important business problems, that they're not solving some like second order technical challenge, but they're really involved in the business. And there's like a bunch of things we can also follow up at a more like tactical level that I think are also relevant.
Finally, Gabriel explains why experimentation is crucial for any data-driven culture and how even negative results are valuable for driving learning and progress. Here's what he had to say.
It's incredibly hard, in my experience, to convince people that experimentation is important and that running an experiment that has a flat or negative result is actually helpful because you are learning that what you thought was a good idea is actually not a good idea. And I found in my own experience, again, in companies that maybe were not born data driven or with an experimentation culture, which is like now very typical in Silicon Valley, of course, and in tech companies in general, to see the value of experimenting. And again, then it falls to who has the strongest voice, who in the meeting is more aggressive, and you shouldn't make business decisions like that. You should let the data speak. But I think that's another big challenge. And going back to your initial question, I agree with you. I think there's like more like maybe low-hanging analytics function that could be that if a company doesn't have it, that by itself, having dashboards, just the basic analytics, that by itself would be incredibly valuable.
Those are just a few highlights from my conversation with Gabriel. Before we jump into the full episode with Gabriel, let's take a quick moment to check in with the fine folk at Delphina who helped to make High Signal possible. Thanks for joining me here, Duncan. It's great to have you here, and I can't thank you enough for all the support you've provided to make this podcast happen. Can you tell us a little bit about Delphina and why you're supporting a podcast focused on AI and machine learning?
Yeah, at Delphina, we are building AI-powered tools for data scientists, and we come across a lot of very kind of skilled practitioners in our work. And so with the podcast, we're looking to identify and share the high signal.
Awesome. And we've just shown a few clips from my conversation with Gabriel, and I'm wondering what resonated in there with you.
Wow, there is so much goodness in the episode with Gabriel. He's such a deep and eloquent thinker. The thing that I wanted to highlight was his discussion around the gap in expectations from really the C-level kind of operators to the folks on the ground. And I think a lot of this is because the power of data and data science has grown 10x, 100x in the last decade, and most leaders can't keep up. And so my mental framework for this is the levels of data literacy. And there's a level 1 in my mind where you're first getting data organized, getting the basic analytics off the ground. Level 2 is starting to show value from predictive analytics and machine learning, basic forecasting, customer segmentation. Level 3 is where you start to multiply the use cases. You have maybe real-time use cases for the first time, delivering value in the product. And then level 4 is kind of self-learning systems and bandit-style frameworks, reinforcement learning live. And the reality is that is a multi-year journey, even for the best and most advanced teams, as you need to evolve the skill set of folks on the team, the data engineering needs, the ML infra needs, the business understanding. And yet I think the mistake that many executives make who aren't exposed to enough of this stuff, and frankly, many data leaders make as well, is they try to jump too far ahead too fast and try to expect themselves to operate at level 4 autonomy when they're really actually just learning to crawl and walk. And so I think you need to be honest with yourself about where you are and how you build the momentum of the freight train and not operate a herky-jerky go-kart as you try to scale the levels.
I couldn't agree more, and I'm so glad that was your series of takeaways from it, because I think a key point was when executives and stakeholders come and say, hey, what's our generative AI strategy? Gabriel made the point, hey, do we have access to particular types of data to even begin this? So it is this hierarchy of needs, and I love how you framed it as these differing levels. So perhaps without further ado, we should jump into the conversation. Friends, viewers, listeners, just a quick note that if you enjoy this podcast, please do share it with friends and colleagues. If you're watching it on YouTube, please do like and subscribe. If you're listening to it on an app, give us 5 stars and write us a review as well. That will help us keep on releasing the podcast you love. Now let's jump in. Hi there, Gabriel, and welcome to the show.
Hi, great to be here.
So great to have you here. I'm so excited to jump in and talk about the types of things you've taught with respect to data science and how it plays into our conceptions of how data, machine learning, AI work more generally. So as we'll get to, you're in Chile. currently again, but you've taught courses on data science in a lot of places, including Stanford, on platforms, online marketplaces, these types of things. So I'm wondering if you could walk us through how US-based platforms, multinationals like Uber, for example, and Mercado Libre in Latin America leverage data science, and why these are powerful examples of data-driven organizations.
Sure. Yeah, so that's right. I'm in Chile now. I'm on leave from Stanford. But at Stanford, I teach classes, as you mentioned, on data science, and in particular data science for platforms, for online markets. And the way I think about the role of data science in platform has to do with what is the business model for two-sided markets? What are they selling? So I think of two-sided markets as selling the reduction of frictions. If you think about like Airbnb, they're not really selling lodging, they're selling a reduction of friction. And what do I mean by that? An important friction is search and information. Like, how would you ever know that there was, I think we're in Berlin now, a one-bedroom, a nice apartment in downtown Berlin for you to rent? And that's what Airbnb is selling you, this search cost. It's also reducing information costs. You can look at the apartment, see the quality, try to infer the quality, and so on. And ultimately, this reduction enables matches between buyers and sellers, in this case, guests and hosts. And if you think at a very high level, what a marketplace, a two-sided marketplace is doing is enabling matches between buyers and sellers. Then it's learning from these matches, it's learning from market participants to further improve this matching process. Like a very high level, you can think about marketplace going through this loop. Now, when there's these matches, as I said before, these platforms collect data to further improve matches. How do they do it? They will use this data to change their ranking algorithm, what they show you. That's very critical for Mercado Libre, you were mentioning, for Airbnb and others, to increase conversions, increase matches. They will decide what information to share with you, what kind of review system they will build. And in all of this, data science is key. How do you use data to improve the product, enhance the functionalities with the ultimate goal of increasing matches and the quality of the matches?
I really appreciate all of that context. And I do think the establishment of online marketplaces is one of the most important, and use of matching algorithms is one of the most important aspects of data and the online environment more generally. Even getting the right information in the hands of the right people is a matching problem. And I think I recently interviewed Michael Jordan from Berkeley for the podcast, and we talked a bunch about Amazon, actually, and how they were one of the really first early examples of really helping reducing friction between supply and demand of originally book sales.
Totally.
I am interested in what you've been seeing in Latin America and Chile in particular since you've been there. And we discussed this last time we spoke, but I think I have a friend who says not everyone needs to do, and he calls it jokingly, Jeff Dean machine learning. Not everyone has to be the Google and these FANG companies and that type of stuff. And so I want to approach the conversation about what we may call reasonable scale machine learning, reasonable scale AI, how a lot of different organizations who may not be Google can adopt these tools. And I actually think you, having been returned to Chile recently, you have a unique perspective in people I have conversations with respect to challenges in developing markets and people adopting a data-driven, machine learning-driven, AI-driven mindset. You've observed that some companies are behind, quote unquote, behind in the use of data in some sense. I'm wondering what this actually means in practice, and what do you think some of the biggest barriers for businesses in developing markets are when it comes to adopting data and artificial intelligence?
Yeah, and I think that I love that question. When I arrived here, I'm from Chile, but recently we've been spending some time after not spending significant amount of time, and like after 20 years in the US. So it was like initially I observed this like huge gap between what I was just discussing and how data is used in these companies like Uber, Amazon, Airbnb, and what I'm seeing in Chile, even in large corporations. Okay, these are like big corporations. And I think I think there's like a few big differences and barriers. One is most of these corporations are not tech companies. They were not born as tech companies. They're not like data science native. It's not something they started doing from the beginning. And now maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, they started realizing, oh, shoot, the world is moving in that direction. We need to do something. It's not like the Amazons of the world are going to eat us. And I think I see a lot of challenges. Like there's this transition period for these companies, and there's technical constraints, finding the right talent. But I think maybe the main challenge that I've seen, really thinking of data as a key component of a company's strategy and to build products. But that's really, that is related to changing the culture of a company. It's like a big cultural change. I think a lot of these large corporations are quite conservative. They have a lot of inertia. Sometimes they operate in markets that aren't super competitive, so they get complacent. And a lot of the decision making is the highest paid person in the room. Maybe the person has it's being the longest in the company. And in data driven organizations, it's not like that. Like you run experiments, you look at the data, and making that shift, I think, is a huge challenge. That has been probably my main observation, which has to do with the culture, how to build a data culture in companies that were not born as with data in mind to make decisions and to build products.
I love it. I love that you framed it in terms of non-data native companies, or companies that weren't born in the quote unquote data revolution, for lack of a better term. That was my term, not yours.
Right.
I do wonder how this relates to companies in the US that have predated this entirely new mindset. So I can give you an example. Years ago, I spoke with an executive at John Deere, trying to convince them certain things around adopting data strategy, this type of stuff. And his response was, and he was being a contrarian, but his response was, we've been operating for years without data, Hugo, without the type of data you're talking about. And we're doing very well as a business. Why would we change that? So I think there's, even in the US, outside of tech companies, there's a slow adoption mindset. So I suppose my question is, how do you think what you've seen in Chile and Latin America relates to non-incumbent and non-traditionally data-driven organizations in the US?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I think a basic question a company needs to ask is, if you think about this like data revolution as a meteor, are you like in the middle? Is the meteor going to cross you? Are you going to be, it will touch you, or is it more farther away? And I think that really depends in which industry you are. Some industries, maybe like data, at least maybe for now, played like not a core critical role, and in others it does. So I think that's the first question. The world will move there. The question is at what speed in the industry you are. It's like, how urgent was this? And given that, I think, suppose you are in an industry where data is becoming increasingly relevant, and maybe there's like startups coming up, perhaps are doing things much better because they use data. So you either like react or peril, right? You need to do something to compete. And I think I see a parallel with some of what I've seen in Chile, some of the concerns you were mentioning, Hugo. If the company is very conservative and it's in the path of the meteor, it will probably not survive. And one of the things that maybe is more relevant now with all this now AI revolution, where there's so much hype, is to really ask yourself, what is a problem I'm actually solving? When there's all this like technological hype, it's very easy to fall in love with the tech and forget that you're still solving a problem, and the tech is a vehicle to solve that problem. And that's something I see both in the US and in Chile. This like frenzy, okay, we need to do something AI, without really understanding how AI can help solve our business problems, like the pain of our customers. So I think in this path, companies that maybe were not born AI, or were not born doing data science, keeping that in mind, I think it's as critical.
I totally agree. And I'm interested in performing some form of, for lack of a better term, gradient ascent, not gradient descent. But what I want to do is imagine that whether we're a company in Chile or one in North America or somewhere in the West that isn't a FANG company, hasn't been data native since the beginning, what type of initiatives do you think data leaders or leaders in these organizations can take to establish more data-driven cultures and get to where we'd like to be?
That's a great and complex question. I think there's so many dimensions to that question. And I think probably like the first thing which is necessary is to have a leadership team that believes in this. I think it's just hard to build a data culture where maybe you have a data team in some office somewhere and it's doing some of these like obscure things that no one understands. And it's not really like in the table with like the C-level. It's not really making business involved in important business decisions. So I guess I'm going back. We can also talk about like more tactical things, but first I'm going back to this
No, I think the cultural things are incredibly
yeah,
important.
I think it's incredibly important and it's necessary. And I think data teams, like or data, if there's a data leadership, I think they also play a role because when you have a technical team, there's a tendency to solve like interesting technical problems. And maybe those interesting technical problems aren't the most relevant for the business. So I think there's a responsibility also for the data team to engage with the business, to understand the business, to find partners, business partners, so that they actually solve important business problems, that they're not solving some like second order technical challenge, but they're really involved in the business. And there's like a bunch of things we can also follow up at a more like tactical level that I think are also relevant.
Great. Maybe we can follow up with that, but take a slightly different tangent on it, in the sense that I did want to ask if you've noticed, and the answer may be no, but if you've noticed any unique challenges in developing economies like Latin America. So I think my specific question is, from your experience in Latin America, where do companies face the most difficulty when trying to build a data-driven culture? Is it more technical, tactical, cultural, or organizational hurdles?
I think probably all of the above. And maybe let me just emphasize like 2 points. One is related to would be discussing that sometimes there's this gap that I see between the C-level and the people on the ground trying to implement these tools, where like the C-level doesn't really understand what they need to do, what's the value of using data, and then just things get lost in translation. The other one is what is the starting point? I think sometimes you talk with executives and tell, well, we need AI. And then you ask basic questions. It's like, where is your data? If I ask you a simple question about, say, your sales, can you access data to give me a quick answer? And in many cases, the answer is no. So it's just like very hard to think about building like machine learning models, like AI models, if you don't have the basic data structure in place, like the pipelines in place, and understanding that, and that this is going to be a journey, that there's, you need to start with the basics. I think that's really important. And I think it's many times in the discussion, it gets overlooked. Start with the basics. And the basics are typically building the pipelines, the data pipelines. You cannot analyze data if you don't have structured data. And maybe let me add a third thing, which is, I think it's important to start with like low-hanging fruit, right? With simple things. We have all these AI tools that are off the shelf, and there are actually simple things that maybe with not too sophisticated data engineering, you can make a lot of progress. For example, if you think about streamlining processes, reducing costs, speeding up some tasks, there's a lot of things you can do with these AI tools that aren't very hard to implement, given all the tools they have, and could have a big impact. So maybe I would summarize it with having a clear leadership that understands the value, starting with the basics, including structuring your data, and also start with like high ROI projects, something that is simple and potentially high impact.
Yeah, I do think all those things are incredibly important. I'm glad you mentioned the last point, because I've seen companies try to build, essentially AI, data-driven ML capabilities, and tried to go with moonshots initially and failed at them. And what that does culturally is no good at all. You want to start with something you can deliver in a short time frame that can deliver value to the organization and get buy-in, essentially, across the board. I also like the point that you made on one end where, and this comes back to something I'll share in the show notes, what Monica Rogati built, the data science, the AI hierarchy of needs, which is, as we've discussed before, it's like Maslow's hierarchy of needs for those who haven't seen it, but AI and machine learning are at the top, and like ETL is at the bottom. So the whole The whole point was try to get a pithy summary to let people know you've got to learn to store, manage, transform, and count before doing anything else.
Absolutely.
But she did that before we had AI, generative AI APIs as well. So now there's this interesting dance happening where it seems like maybe we can build more things more easily. But of course, once you see the cool generative AI demos, you realize you then need to get them in the software development lifecycle and get them integrated into your entire infrastructure stack. So I'm wondering what changes here for you and for things you're seeing in Chile now that generative AI has exploded.
So I agree with you. I think we have tools, first you think about like copilots, where the barriers to entry to develop some of these things have gone down. And potentially you can build cool products with like much smaller teams. And I think that's something that should help in this transition to becoming more data driven. It's still, even though the tools are there, I think there's all these other frictions that we've been discussing that needs to get resolved before that happens. But I do think that there's a huge opportunity by using these tools where someone that perhaps with not such a technical background can make like reasonable progress on solving a technical challenge. And I think that should be definitely helpful. It's also, I think, having, you mentioned what is the cost of investing in these projects and not having a win. And I totally agree with you. In organizations, I've seen this in many places, organizations that they don't have a culture of data, showing quick wins is key. Like in most of these organizations, most people do not understand the value. They do not see the value. And for people I ask that have worked on these things and see the value, have experienced the value, we shouldn't give that for granted. We need to convince the organization that these tools are valuable. And having quick wins is key. And perhaps with these Gen AI tools, it may be easier to have quick wins where, maybe you don't need such a long cycle to build something that's helpful. And I think companies should definitely leverage these off-the-shelf tools before doing this like super ambitious, like this moonshot projects that you were also talking about.
Absolutely. Some of the best initiatives I've seen early on for people adopting more data-driven cultures is just lead qualifying for your sales team. So on Monday, they get an automated email, this is the spreadsheet of people to reach out to in the next 3 hours. And you see higher conversions that way. Also, I am interested, and this is slightly tangential, the ability to use generative AI in a less generative sense, but for in-context learning and non-technical people to be able to speak with it in natural language to build machine learning models. I am interested though. So for companies in places like Chile that are beginning to adopt machine learning and data science, as well as companies in North America that are beginning to adopt these types of things, where do you think they'll see the most immediate return on investment? Would it be in dashboards for decision-making or automating decision-making processes?
It's a good question. I think it really depends on the industry and in which, going back to this hierarchy of needs, like where the industry is. There's some industry, I don't know, think of construction. That's an industry that hasn't evolved, like the technology hasn't evolved that much. And I think in that industry, like very basic things will have a huge ROI, just like managing inventories, managing purchasing processes. And there's also off-the-shelf tools for this. And more companies are adopting this. I think that just that, you can think about more sophisticated things, but just that will have an impact. Now, if you think about like more customer-facing digital experiences, you think about like retailing or banking, I think those companies need to go a step further and really use data to improve products. And perhaps not streamlining the process, but improve products, improve the interaction with customers, the offerings, following a customer journey and see whether they can improve it, what tech companies do. And I think that's actually existential for those companies. If I think about big retailers in Chile, banks in Chile, if they don't, you're asking about ROI, and I think it's just more than like large ROI. I think this is existential. If they don't move in that direction, where they're using data to build products, as we were discussing at the very beginning, your first question is how to use data like in online marketplaces. I think it's just going to be hard for them to survive.
So this is incredibly important, right? And incredibly important to you. I can't imagine the journey in being from Chile, going to America, doing all the work you've done and returning and seeing this gap, which is a technical gap, organizational gap, skills gap. But this gap between countries in the global south like Chile and countries in the US in terms of AI and data science capabilities, particularly now we live in a globally connected world where big tech companies, they don't stay in Silicon Valley. They make pretty serious plays in a lot of, we don't need to get into the nitty gritty of those tactics. But what steps do you think companies in developing markets can take to start closing that gap?
Yeah. We touch upon a lot of these things, but if you were to summarize some of these ideas and what would be maybe more advice thinking of a path to closing this gap, to building a company that uses data to improve their business. Again, like I don't want to be too insistent, but I think it really starts with a vision, a commitment of leadership, and really think that this is like a long journey. Okay, this is going to be, if you think about companies that have done this successfully in the US, think of Walmart, that at some point realize, okay, we need to become like omni-channel. We need to have a digital experience that it's also integrated with the physical experience. That was like a long journey, and you need a commitment to do that. And then start with the basics. You don't start with the most sophisticated things. And the basics, as you were saying, it could be collecting data in a smart way in an Excel file, which is what are your like largest customers? What may be the customers that will have the highest chance of converting? And when and for some of these projects, you may not need super sophisticated like data engineering, and I would start with those. Like start with like high ROI projects, the low hanging fruit, show quick wins, and then move to more sophisticated data engineering, data products, where again you can also speed them up with the use of off-the-shelf tools. But I think companies really need to understand that at least in some industries, this is going to be existential. Companies that have that vision, have a leadership, have a much higher chance of surviving. And really, I think what's also key, some of these companies have already invested a tremendous amount of money into what's called like digital transformation, and they just haven't been successful. It just has not paid off. And I think it goes back to this idea of having these silos, these people doing technical stuff, data stuff that is not really integrated with the business. And it just doesn't make an impact. You need to break those silos, bring those technical people inside the business, engage them with business problems. And let me just mention one more thing is, it's very common also in these companies that internal organizations own their data. And it's not like a culture of like open data. And that's what makes some of these internal orgs valuable is, okay, this is my data. And if someone else would come and ask you, okay, I need that piece of data, I say, no, well, I'm not sure I can share it, which like makes absolutely no sense. So that there's like a repository of all the data in the company, and these data sets don't talk to each other. So also like building a culture of openness, of open data, I think it's also critical.
I couldn't agree more. And I actually think open data and building internal platforms that allow people to leverage all the data, because all the data you can have. And then it was at places like Uber where they really started revolutionizing not on just data stores, but feature stores. They realized people in different departments were generating the same features or similar features all the time. So making sure they were accessible to everyone. And I do think this idea of making sure the data function isn't siloed, as we've both seen across a lot of tech companies, there are pros and cons, right? But one of the, I suppose, most effective models has been the data science team embedded across different organizations, right? Where they're like, you'll have a data scientist on the growth marketing team, one on product, whatever it may be, one with sales, but they all have dotted lines to a centralized data team as well. And it means they take ownership. And it's rare for me to meet a data scientist who wants to be treated like a service center or be given the orgs where data scientists are responding to tickets are some of the least successful.
Absolutely. And it's very easy. I've seen it like many times. It's very easy to become that. And basically once you do that, kind of use like old perspective of priorities. You're just like answering questions like all the time, as opposed to thinking about it, what would really add value to the business. And I think also doing that shift, I think is really important. And I think being a data leader, I think has a lot to do with that. It's really like prioritizing what are the big business opportunities. And that's why like when I talk to companies, not just in Chile, but in the US, I think it's really critical to have data leadership that understands the technical aspects, but also the business aspects, and can actually really combine these two to make the right choices, the right priority, like work on the right priorities.
Absolutely. And I've found also having data scientists and MLEs who have more of an entrepreneurial spirit, and they're there to solve business problems, not just technical problems, as we've discussed as well, but they're interested in what they're actually solving for. I am interested in, let's say we're in a situation, so it's clear that we need really executive level buy-in, if not board buy-in, to be honest, right? And shareholder buy-in.
Yes.
But let's say I'm a data leader in an organization and my team's, I'm using a cliche here, but I've got a data team that works in the basement and they're big bearded guys like me. And I'm a data leader and I want to get more executive buy-in. What type of strategies can I use to make sure that my bosses and the executive and leadership, I can get as much buy-in from them as possible to be data-driven?
That's a great question. So maybe like the first advice I'll give is try, if you're a data leader, like try to work in a company that has already like leadership buy-in.
Totally.
It's just very, what I've seen is like very hard to change that like bottom up. And it has to do with also what you were saying is if you don't have buy-in, not just from the C-level, but also you brought a good point from the board. And what I've seen in Chile also, what I was mentioning before is the gap between the C-level and sometimes the people working in the problems. That also applies to the board, which happens quite often. Chile and maybe other countries in Latin America are pretty like conservative. And so you have this kind of old guard of that's typical like in boards that may not understand what a data scientist, how a data scientist could add value. So maybe first, if you can try to work in a company that has buy-in, and I've learned that the hard way sometimes. And I think okay, let's say like you're faced with this challenge. I think you need to be incredibly entrepreneurial. This is what you were saying, Hugo. You really need to go out, find partners. Like probably the main thing I would do is find the right partners. So if maybe like you don't have buy-in from leadership already, but maybe you can find the right business partners within the organization that are willing to try things to you that are impactful to the business. And if you can do that, and you can show that to leadership, at least that will probably give you the best shot. So I think it's really a combination of being entrepreneurial and find the right partners. And it doesn't need to be solving complex problems. It has to do with solving relevant first order problems.
There's the other thing that I've seen happen whereby you can provide analytics as a new data function that gives people so much information about what's happening that they have their hands full then as well. And they're like, hey, the first two insights actually are all we need currently because they will solve a lot of things for us. And we actually don't need a massive function, right?
Yeah, I think that's also like a helpful starting point. So maybe I was talking more about a data science function, but you're absolutely right. There's basic analytics that would be helpful. In my experience in these large companies, so maybe the interfaces are not great, or maybe they're not immediately available, but there's some analytics already. But what's really lacking is how to use data to improve products, to really embed data in, say, a customer journey, in how you improve the offerings to customers, reduce churn, all these things that data science would do. I think the other important aspect that really lacks typically is experimentation. And it's incredibly hard, in my experience, to convince people that experimentation is important. And that running an experiment that has a flat or negative result is actually helpful because you are learning that what you thought was a good idea is actually not a good idea. And I found in my own experience, again, in companies that maybe were not born data-driven or with an experimentation culture, which is like now very typical in Silicon Valley, of course, and in tech companies in general, to see the value of experimenting. And again, then it falls to who has the strongest voice, who in the meeting is more aggressive, and you shouldn't make business decisions like that. You should let the data speak. But I think that's another big challenge. And going back to your initial question, I agree with you. I think there's like more like maybe low-hanging analytics function that could be that if a company doesn't have it, that by itself, having dashboards, just the basic analytics, that by itself could be incredibly valuable.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned the importance of experimentation and the importance of negative results as well. As you may recall, I used to work, my background's in cell biology and biophysics, and
Yeah.
I always wish there was a journal of negative results because we all do the same negative results. And then you meet someone at a conference, they're like, oh yeah, I tried that and it didn't work, but there's no incentive to publish negative results.
Yeah.
On
That's right.
a tech company and data-driven side, I actually recently interviewed, I think your colleague, Ramesh Johari,
Yes. Yeah. Good
for
friend.
the show. Man, he's cool, isn't he?
Yeah. He's awesome. Ramesh is awesome.
And we did an episode around the importance of experimentation, how to develop a self-learning organization, as he put it, but also, to your point, making sure there's a culture in which people not only feel comfortable getting negative results, but recognize that getting negative results may not impact the business in the short term, but in medium to long-term learnings, particularly if you try to gather insights longitudinally across experiments, what you can learn as an organization then.
Absolutely.
And reshifting to that mindset, I think.
Absolutely. And creating like shifted to that mindset is not obvious. It's pretty interesting because we come from Silicon Valley and we think this is like obvious, like experimentation this is just how you do things. And then you come with an environment where people have never run experiments. And it's what I found in my personal experience, just so hard to convince people that this is valuable. It's a big, like if we think it's a good idea, let's just implement it. Like, why would we spend time running experiments? Because maybe it's not a good idea. Roughly 80% of experiments running 10 companies are either flat or negative. Some of the things we try are not great. So finding the value of that process, I think, is super important.
And what's the blocker there, though? Because I think business leaders historically and current good business leaders have a deeply experimental mindset. It may not be a quantitative experimental mindset in the way we're talking about it and the way implemented places like Uber, Airbnb, Amazon, and so on. But if someone tells me Henry Ford wasn't a crazy experimentalist, I'd say there's no way he didn't experiment every day with new ideas. And same with, we look at something like alcohol, right? Sorry, it's nearly 4 p.m. and I'm in Germany, so I think I feel people are drinking Muskrug's out there. But so the Guinness factory, it was William Gossett there who published a paper about statistical tests. He couldn't publish under his real name because he worked at Guinness, so his pseudonym was Student, right? So he published the Student T-test, which came out of Guinness, right? So historically, we've had a lot of businesses that embrace experimentation, maybe not in the most quantitative sense. So how do we convince business leaders that this is the way to do some forms of experimentation now?
I think that's a great question, which I personally struggle with. And in my experience, it also has to do actually like even let's say like a business leader say, okay, we should like experiment. And that's a message. It's a message to the company. Okay, but we should like, we have this, I don't know, Stanford professor is trying to help us build an experimentation function. Why don't you guys be nice and like helping? And I also think that's like valuable to the business. And I think what I've seen also sometimes you get resistance from the actual teams, and the resistance comes, I think, from a few reasons. One is, why do we want to spend this? We need to crank this. We need to launch. We don't have time to experiment. The other one is, you don't have an infrastructure, is an experimentation infrastructure. It takes time, and you may need to invest engineering resources that are scarce, that are typically scarce in companies, and people are just not willing to do that. So I guess it's not just about willing to experiment. I think there's also a commitment to a minimum level of resources, to have a basic infrastructure to enable the experimentation. And I think that transition, it's not that simple. And again, what we're discussing before, probably if you're involved in this effort, like the most valuable thing you can do is show wins. And again, like wins, it's interesting how you define wins, because a win may be like realizing that what you thought was a good idea is not a good idea. So that's just harder to show to a CEO. But then if you start like aggregating results, maybe like over some period, you ran like 100 experiments, and then you should listen, like 20, 30% were positive, and this is the lift. I think that's very compelling. And so I work in a startup in Latam, building their experimentation infrastructure. We have all of the above, like all the challenges I just mentioned. It wasn't easy, but what I thought was compelling is to the leadership is actually showing this effort of not just running one experiment, running tens of experiments, and how eventually by iterating you get to the right answer. Like maybe you won't get to the right answer at the first experiment, not even at the first 10 experiments, but eventually by iterating this process, you're learning and getting to a better answer. And I think that's compelling. So if you find the right partners, like a use case where you can do that, I think that can be a game changer.
Very cool. And it's great to hear of a particular case in which you're working with a company on the ground there. And to your point about you need to invest in engineering and platform stuff, I've worked in startups. I've never worked for a massive company. It's not really my type of thing, but I've been in startups for a decade. And the story I've seen, even at companies that have become huge, they'll hire their first data scientist or two, and those people will become essentially data engineers for 12,
Yes.
if not 18 or 24 months, right?
Yes.
And
That's
they'll
right.
have issues with AA testing, right? Like it's
Yes.
the
Yeah.
infrastructure. And we could do I'd actually love to do an episode or a panel on the importance of AA testing sometime. But the point being that if you don't get the infrastructure set up, the experimentations don't even work. And there is a non-trivial, actually, yeah, a not insignificant initial investment that needs to be put in. Of course, historically, products like Optimizely have helped us a huge
That's
amount
right.
in getting over
That's
these hurdles. But
that's right. That's absolutely right. And I think what's also hard is how to use experimentation to really change valuable parts of the product. So something that is not hard is like run experiments to test different like messaging strategies. Do you email? Do you send text messages? Like how, in what frequency? That's easy. I think what's much harder is let's use experiments. We have all these ideas to actually change the product. How do we run experiments to do that? Because that requires engineering resources. So you need to have an organization that has enough flexibility and willing to spend engineering resources. There's this like treatments that you want to test, okay, but those treatments require some engineering resources to get built. So you need the willingness to actually do that. And I think that's another challenge I've seen when building an experimentation culture.
absolutely. So I am interested in bringing the conversation back to your experience now in Latin America. And you have said that if these big companies don't get serious, they will fail. And I'm wondering, I suppose I haven't necessarily got a well-formed question here, but I think it revolves around current incumbents, perhaps. So companies that are Latin American, but not necessarily data, ML, AI native, then American companies that maybe are trying to, make movements into that region versus local startups. So you've got this triangle of how do you see these dynamics playing out, and what's your optimistic take?
Yeah, no, I do have an optimistic take. So let me start with some data. So there's this Latin American AI index that an organization here in Chile actually builds. And what you see in the data, and that's basically trying to figure out what is the state of development of like technical tools like AI in Latin America across different countries. So what is that, for example, a country like Chile is number one in Latin America, but it's like way behind the US, way behind the North. Okay. And if you double click on a country like Chile, which is the most advanced Latin America, you have the talent. There's a lot of research coming out. There's the technical capabilities, but there's like very little investment and sophistication in large corporations. So, for example, when you look at the R&D in developed countries, 2/3 of the R&D is done in companies, 1/3 is done in universities. In the developing world, countries like Chile, Latin America, It's the opposite. The ratio is reverse. So there's like
Mm.
very little R&D in companies happening in companies. And I think like with these large companies, maybe because of all the challenges we've discussed, maybe that's just hard to change, even though some will and some are. Uh, and for that reason, I think going back to your question, like fostering an ecosystem of innovation where startups can thrive, I think is critical. I think that's what's going to maybe start closing the gap. And if I think about policies, I would think, how do we reduce the barriers to start companies, to hire people quickly, to develop infrastructure, to help fostering an ecosystem of startups where we can also attract funding? Because we have the talent we have a great engineering schools in Chile and Argentina and Brazil, but sometimes we're lacking other things to build the ecosystem. And that's where I have an optimistic view, how, and that's my hope to build, which already started like 20 years ago. There was nothing in Chile. There's absolutely no entrepreneurship in Chile, no tech ecosystem. Relative to the US, it's still small, but it's like way larger. And there's like a few unicorns, way larger than 20 years ago. And I think that's the direction we need to move. And relative to maybe companies in the US, I think, which some have come to Latam with success, others with less success. I do think there's a space for local startups, like really knowing the culture, like, speaking the language, in how, a lot of this customer facing applications is important. Um, Understanding the local institutions and so on, it's important. So I think there's like a huge opportunity. There's a lot of exciting things happening in tech in Latin America, and I just hope and I think that will continue to grow. And I think that's critical. Going back to one of the previous questions you asked, in terms of closing the gap, the technological gap between Latin America and say the US.
Look, all of that is so exciting, and I appreciate your optimism. It gives me a renewed optimism. I also love the focus on enabling local communities and local people to do things that are important to them and build software, build companies, build movements. I had Andrew Gelman on the podcast recently, and I lamented to him that we were having local elections. I was in Australia at the time, and our papers were filled with more information about the upcoming American election than the local election, which is arguably significantly more important to us, right? So I am excited about a renewed focus on local communities. Also, I'd love to see more Spanish language models. For example, the fact that my friends who want to interact with language models in Spanish will go to ChatGPT, which was trained on web scale corpus, which is 70-80% English language, but it has enough translation capabilities to go back and forth and do that type of stuff, right? Imagine if the people of Chile had their own model, which incorporated
It's
without all
yeah.
this external noise, the stuff that was important to them.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, because I was just like last week talking to a researcher here in Chile that has a research center on AI, and they're building the first Spanish LLM. And I was asking him, like, initially that didn't make sense to me. It's like, well, we have ChatGPT and I use it in Spanish. It seems to work pretty well. Um, Basically, the point he made was it's not about translation. Like, these models could be pretty good at translation. It's about capturing local culture. GPT is trained on a corpus that is maybe 90% in English. And what he claims is that doesn't capture local knowledge and local culture. So basically, they're training this model with very specific like corpus of knowledge that is localized to Latin America. So this would be documents that are like getting from the national libraries of the different countries, things that you would not find in the web, but constitute a really important like local knowledge. So I'm like really curious to see how does it work and like how does it compare with ChatGPT. I think it's a fascinating project.
I couldn't agree more. And I'd love an abstract. So one of my challenges with ChatGPT is it's just a bit For an Australian, it's just a bit American. Like, it has an American vibe to it, and it's a bit
Yeah.
polite in a classically American way. My German friends actually like, I can't stand how polite it is. I wish it would just say to me, "You're wrong." Not, "Of course I'll
Yeah.
do this." And
Yeah.
I don't necessarily want an Australian LLM that's, "G'day, mate, go down to the blah, rah, 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 throw
Yeah.
shrimps on the barbie," all of that, but something that would capture more about Australia, I definitely find interesting. The other thing you mentioned about building, we're talking about organizational culture. We're also talked about building a more like city-based culture and country-based culture of startups and technology and this type of stuff. And that does remind me of what we've seen happen across parts of North America in the past decade, right?
Mm,
It used to be very much localized in Silicon
that's
Valley.
right.
I lived in New York for the best part of a decade. During that time, I saw a lot of data science, ML,
That's
and
right.
AI shift over there.
Yeah.
We've seen Austin, Texas grow a lot. Nashville has a lot of Python startup-y stuff happening
Yeah.
now. And similarly, Miami has a bunch. Miami's a different story because everyone from Web3 pivoted to AI, so you can't even tell what's happening there. But I do get a sense there does feel like there's a sea change happening. So I do think your optimism isn't only warranted, but I think it's pointing in a very good direction.
Yeah, and I think what's critical is to provide, like, governments, in my view, should provide the right incentives to create these ecosystems. And so my hope is that in Chile, that startups are built here and they want to stay here. Of course, they'll go to Chile is too small, right? So they need to like operate in Brazil and Mexico, like the large Latin markets.
Mm.
But that the talent, the teams stay here. And for that, I think you need to provide the right incentive structures. So that's my hope for Chile and Latin America more broadly.
Amazing. So I'd love to chat some other time about the incentive structures we can set up from that particular level. But I think to wrap up now, I'd just love to get a sense of there's a there's not only a skills gap in a lot of places, there's a literacy gap. And something I've seen, you mentioned there are a lot of good engineers. I'm interested if there are people who can think in a data sense, because I think the engineering skills can be picked up in some ways, but for engineers to start shifting to a data mindset of building software that incorporates the entropy of the real world, where you need different types of monitoring and maybe not unit tests, but more smoke tests and these types of things. I'm wondering, just given the cultural barriers in many companies, both in LATAM and elsewhere, what strategies you've seen when it comes to fostering data literacy among business leaders and decision makers, and even in government?
Yeah. No, I think there's like when you think about business leaders, I think there's a huge gap. And I was recently actually taught a class in a program that a research center did for, I don't know, hundreds, like maybe 200 C-level executives in Chile. And it was basically about teaching the basics of machine learning and AI. Uh,
Mm.
I think they're evaluating the results. Like, it was like a long, like a few months program, and it was like serious content. They're evaluating the results. I don't know. Maybe for a next episode, I'll tell you how effective it was. But absolutely super important to have this type of training programs.
I am interested, and we've talked around this a bit, in wrapping up with where you see key areas for future development. So essentially where you see the biggest growth opportunities for data science and AI in Latin America, and what businesses and governments, I like the important aspect of shifting incentives to make sure everyone's incentivized to move in this direction, but what businesses and governments in the region can do to become more competitive in the global data economy.
So the biggest opportunities. So one, I actually thought in government, like governments are tremendously inefficient. In Chile, we have a huge issue about permits. So when you want to do an investment project, permits can take years to process. And that's just like pure inefficiency. And there's some political barriers as well, but
Wow.
there's a lot of inefficiency that be solved and speed up with AI. That's something I'm trying to look at actually. So I'm really hoping that governments will modernize and become more efficient and serve the needs of the people. The other area I'm like really excited about is education and health. So the access to education and health in countries in Latin America that not everyone has access to good education and health. And if you go to remote regions, for example, in Chile, maybe there's going to be one teacher for 50 kids from K to high school, all in a room, using AI tools to aid these teachers, having like more personalized education program for the different students, think there's just a tremendous opportunity there. In terms of health, it's similar. You go to remote locations in Latin America and there's no specialists. Maybe there's one general doctor, but no specialists. So using AI tools to aid doctors with more specific needs that patients will have, that's a tremendous opportunity. So I think maybe what I'm mentioning, these are opportunities with a large positive social impact. Of course, there's a bunch of other opportunities in retailing, in banking, access to financial products that are also super exciting. And already like in this ecosystem of startups, there's a lot of things happening in that space. So I think it's like a really exciting time. We're all super excited and then also sometimes looking maybe with a bit of hesitation, like how AI will pan out. I'm a tech optimist, so I see a lot of opportunity. Of course, there's challenges that we need to manage. But maybe just to wrap up, I'll probably finish with the message that there's like many different paths that the AI can take. And this is not like exogenous. It's not something that will just happen. It's really a function of what policymakers, business leaders will do, like what decisions that they will make. My hope for the future is that we'll make the decisions so that these tools, AI tools, will for the most part have a positive societal impact.
I'm excited for that future as well. And we have a lot of work to do, but we're doing it. And I appreciate your optimism. I want to thank you to wrap up for not only your time and wisdom and generosity, but also a refreshing and different take and new knowledge from a different part of the world. As you know, and as our viewers and listeners know, I live in Australia. I honestly still know more about the US tech scene than the Australian tech scene for a variety of reasons.
Yeah.
I'm in Europe at the moment. As you know, I'm in Berlin, and there's so much exciting AI, data science, ML stuff happening here, but we don't hear about it as much as we do about what's happening in North America. We very rarely hear about what's happening in places like Chile and Latin America. So for you to come here and bring this wealth of knowledge and experience, very much appreciate that, Gabriel.
Absolutely. It was really fun for me.
Thanks so much for listening to High Signal, brought to you by Delphina. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter, follow us on YouTube, and share the podcast with your friends and colleagues. Like and subscribe on YouTube and give us 5 stars and a review on iTunes and Spotify. This will help us bring you more of the conversations you love. All the links are in the show notes. We'll catch you next time.